This program was produced by Now You Know Media.
Module 1, Topic 2. From the baptismal font at Corpus Christi Church in Manhattan to the Trappist Monastery of Gethsemane in Louisville, Kentucky. Thomas Merton, as I noted, was baptized at Corpus Christi Church. And in my visits to Corpus Christi Church and visiting the baptismal font where actually Thomas Merton was baptized, the story of his conversion very much comes alive. It was Thomas Merton who was sitting in his room at Columbia University, who was pondering, thinking, and as I noted, was struck by grace, walked over to Corpus Christi Rectory and met Father Ford. And Father Ford was actually walking on the street, and he stopped to speak to Father Ford and went into the little waiting room in the rectory. And if you go into that little waiting room today, there's a picture of Thomas Merton where he had that first conversation with Father Ford about his desire now to become a Catholic. And in visiting the baptismal font, the current pastor of Corpus Christi Church told me that every year there are a couple of students from Columbia University who read The Seven-Story Mountain and who are very much moved by it and have their own religious experience. And there's always been a few each year, he tells me, that come into the Catholic Church as a result of reading The Seven-Story Mountain and visiting that baptismal font in Corpus Christi Church in Manhattan. So this is a very special place in the life of Thomas Merton. After his baptism, Merton continued to struggle in terms of what he was going to do with his life. And it was one of his professors at Columbia, Dan Walsh, who also became a good friend of Thomas Merton's, suggested to Thomas Merton, might you consider becoming a Trappist monk? And Merton writes about that in The Seven-Story Mountain, and he says the very idea of becoming a Trappist monk, living such an ascetical life, this withdrawal from the world, is one that made me shiver. So the very first notion of becoming a Trappist monk, when it was first introduced to him, was one that he shunned. His initial instinct was that he wanted to enter a religious community, and he decided in that time period that he thought he might even want to be a priest. And so what happened was he applied to the Franciscan order. And they initially accepted Thomas Merton. And then when they found out about the promiscuous lifestyle and the fact that he had fathered a child while he was at Cambridge, they withdrew the acceptance. And so Thomas Merton then began a teaching position, teaching English at St. Bonaventure University up in Olean, New York. And while he was there, he continued to discern this vocation. And he went on a retreat to the Trappist Monastery in Louisville, Kentucky. And it was during Holy Week. And when he went on the retreat, he was very much drawn all of a sudden to this monastery that he initially felt he didn't want to do, that he didn't like the idea. It made him shiver. During the same time period, in that same year, 1939, he also heard that the Baroness Catherine Doherty was working with the poor in Harlem. So in that year, two things are going on simultaneously. He is drawn to the monastery, and he's also drawn to being with the poor in Harlem. And he was conflicted. He wasn't exactly sure what he wanted to do. And so what happened was he then goes back to St. Bonaventure University And there's a little statue, and it's still there, of the little flower. And he was praying in front of that statue. And while he was praying in front of that statue, he heard the bells ringing in his mind, the bells ringing of the monastery of Gethsemane in Louisville, Kentucky. And it was there while he was praying in front of that statue, and he writes about this in Seven-Story Mountain, that he now is drawn to the monastery and decides that this is what he will do. And so in 1941, he begins the journey to Gethsemane, to the monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane. And he writes about this, again, in the Seven-Story Mountain. He writes about the train ride to the monastery. And he says that mile after mile, my desire to be in the monastery increased beyond belief. What if they did not receive me? Then I'd have to go to the army. But surely that would be a disaster. Not at all, if after all of this I was rejected by the monastery and had to be drafted. It would be quite clear that it was God's will. I had done everything that was in my power. The rest was in God's hands. I was free. I had recovered my liberty. I belonged to God, not to myself. And to belong to God is to be free.